These days, this is as close as you can get to the Russian embassy, for obvious reasons with all of the difficulties we face around the world. And sometimes we forget too easily that this too was the centre of Cold War espionage. Berlin, the city written about in Berlin Game by Len Deighton, or Joseph Cannon in The Good German, and countless works by the unsurpassable John le Carré. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to also explore the world of Cold War espionage in Berlin. The building behind me is Friedrichstrasse railway station, which also plays an important role in the history of Cold War espionage in Berlin. This was one of the two major crossing points throughout the Cold War, between West Berlin on the one hand and East Berlin on the other. The entire railway station was in East Berlin, but divided into two sections, one for rail services to West Berlin and West Germany, and the other for the domestic local railway system in East Berlin. Now, no doubt many spies met here on the platforms of the station, exchanging documents, although it was well watched. But most particularly, although there were very strict passport and security controls to make sure that nobody with the wrong papers left, particularly East German citizens, once you got to West Berlin, there were no checks of any meaning. In fact, there simply weren't any passport checks at all. It's hard to believe that this was actually the point at which people entered East Germany. Just around about here is where all the control booths were for passport control. Quite unnerving really, but it shows just how much the world has changed. A place that was full of fear and also the border point between East and West, an area of division, is now a normal railway station where people are eating pretzels and drinking coffee. And now we're heading up the steps from what was the control area to the platform, and these were actually the platforms where there were 4 tracks and you could take a train to West Berlin. And the East German communists took every opportunity to make money out of the situation, and actually had duty-free shops on the platforms selling very cheap vodka and even cheaper Western cigarettes. When you look over on the other side, and you can see that there's a train leaving, there was actually a metal wall all the way along the station between these pillars that you can see. On this side, which is where the Western trains were, they were full of advertisements for East German luxury goods like Praktika cameras or lenses from Carl Zeiss Jena. On the other side, the 2 platforms you can see under the smaller roof, well, on that side there were no adverts, and also the East Berliners couldn't hear anything from these platforms, because those 2 platforms on the other side, where you see the local train actually leaving right now, were the 2 platforms that were used for East Berlin's domestic local railway service, the S-Bahn. So obviously one side had to be hermetically sealed from the other. As we walk through Friedrichstrasse, you have to realise that it wasn't just these lines above ground. There were S-Bahn, that's the local railway, and even underground lines below us, which enabled people to travel to and from West Berlin to come to East Berlin, East Germany, and onwards to Eastern Europe. It really is quite extraordinary how this railway station was hermetically sealed into 2 parts and able to carry out all of the border controls. Terrifying, I think, in a way as well, but thankfully that all belongs to the past now, and everyone can simply go about their business normally, as you'd expect in a railway station. High up there in the roof, that's where you would have found the East German border guards with their machine guns, just keeping an eye over everything. So it was very easy for the East German Stasi to send agents to the west through the city's railway system, and that's something they did. Quite bizarrely, although we would call these people spies, the official East German term was Kundschafter des Friedens, which translated, and it's not easy to translate, kind of means bringers of peace, or scouts of peace, or even those who are going to paint the way forward to peace. All a bit grand for people who too often were actually trying to undermine Western European institutions and politicians as well. So, an interesting way really to just describe plain old, good old-fashioned spies.
Now we need to hop on the S-Bahn City Railway to head from the heart of Berlin to the capital's most southwesterly suburb.
Nothing is more vivid in our imaginations than spy stories with gripping ends, and many of them include exchanges of spies, generally here on the Glienicke Bridge. The reality is somewhat different. First of all, this bridge was badly damaged at the end of the Second World War. It took the East Germans 4 years to restore it, and then later, when the Berlin Wall went up, the bridge was closed to all traffic. From that time on, the bridge was only used on 4 occasions, yes, just 4 occasions, for exchanges of prisoners. First of all, in 1962, following a spy mission by the American airman Gary Powers, who took off in 1960 in a U-2 reconnaissance plane from Peshawar in Pakistan, the first ever US mission to overfly the whole of the Soviet Union to spy. He was shot down by a missile. Unfortunately, well, fortunately for him, he escaped, but unfortunately, a Soviet aircraft was shot down at the same time, and that pilot was killed. The Americans denied all wrongdoing, basically claiming, rather unlikely perhaps, but that this was actually a weather expedition. Anyhow, in 1962, he was finally exchanged over this bridge. No further exchanges happened until 1985, when the rather unfortunate American Arthur D. Nicholson actually had his corpse transported over the bridge. He had been an American serviceman who'd been spying deep inside East German territory and was shot by a Soviet sentry. Later on, in 1986, there were 2 further exchanges. 23 American spies who had been in Eastern Europe, or rather spying for the United States, were exchanged for Eastern spies in the other direction. And then finally a group of spies was swapped, and on the other side, from the Soviet side, the famous dissident Anatoly Sharansky was also sent in a westward direction. In fact, this is the slow walk that people would have made from east to west. And I'm now around about in the middle of the bridge, which is exactly where the border was, almost imagining the guards facing off, one side against the other, KGB against CIA. Now obviously this bridge has entered the public imagination, literature and films. For example, Len Deighton's Berlin Game, and much more recently, in 2015, Steven Spielberg's masterpiece, I think so at any rate, Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks. But it's extraordinary to think that it was only used to exchange spies on 4 occasions. And finishing this story, just 2 days after the Berlin Wall fell, this bridge was reopened as one of the first crossing points, and happy Potsdammers, East Germans and Berliners reunited across the bridge. A fitting end to one of the most gripping locations in spy history anywhere in the world.
Next time, join us as we cross the city's main forest to find the Devil's Mountain, the West's listening post against the Communist East. And we'll also discover Berlin's iconic border crossing, Checkpoint Charlie. If you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and ask for notifications.